They laughed when Oberstfreiter Klaus Richter proposed welding extra armor plates at 45-degree angles to the Panzer IV's turret, called it Richter's folly, a waste of precious steel that would slow the tanks and accomplish nothing. But 6 weeks later, when German panzers rolled through the Arc de Triomphe and French generals surrendered in the same railway car where Germany had been humiliated in 1918, nobody was laughing anymore. The modification that High Command dismissed as silly had changed everything, turned vulnerable steel boxes into nearly invincible fortresses, and transformed a mechanic with grease-stained hands into the most important soldier in the Wehrmacht. But on this cold morning in March 1940, standing in a depot outside Koblenz with his wrench and his impossible idea, Klaus Richter had no idea he was about to rewrite the rules of armored warfare and doom an entire nation in the process. The morning mist clung to the Rhine Valley like a burial shroud, and Klaus could taste metal in the air, part river damp, part the acrid tang of diesel exhaust from the 100 Panzer IVs lined up across the depot. He stood before Panzer 411, his assigned tank, running calloused fingers along the turret's flat armor plate while his mind performed calculations that had kept him awake for 3 nights straight. Still obsessing over armor angles, Richter? Feldwebel Otto Kraus appeared from behind the tank, his sergeant's insignia catching the weak sunlight. The engineers in Berlin designed these machines. What makes you think a farm boy from Bavaria knows better? Klaus didn't look away from the turret. His fingers traced the perpendicular joint where the armor met the chassis, feeling the vulnerability like an open wound. Because engineers in Berlin don't get shot at, Herr Feldwebel. And I do. Not yet, you don't. We haven't invaded anything. Kraus pulled out a cigarette, cupped his hands against the wind to light it. War hasn't started. War's always about to start. That's why we're here, isn't it? Klaus finally turned, meeting Kraus's skeptical gaze. I was at the proving grounds last month when they tested French anti-tank rounds against captured Char B-1 armor. The shells that hit at an angle deflected. The ones that hit perpendicular punched straight through. So look at our tanks, Herr Feldwebel. Every surface is flat, perpendicular. We're giving the enemy perfect 90-degree targets. Klaus gestured to the Panzer IV's turret. But if we add sloped armor, plates welded at 45 degrees, the shells would deflect instead of penetrate. Basic geometry. Basic physics. Kraus took a long drag, studied Klaus through the smoke. You want to modify Wehrmacht property. Without authorization. Based on your basic geometry. I want to keep my crew alive when the shooting starts. Noble. Also insubordinate. But Kraus didn't walk away. He stepped closer to the tank, examining it with the eyes of someone who'd survived the Great War in a different kind of machine. How much extra weight? 400 kilograms if we're smart about placement. The Maybach engine can handle it. We're not maximizing power output anyway. Klaus was already pulling sketches from his pocket, rough drawings made by flashlight in his barracks bunk. Critical protection for turret and glacis plate. Angled at 45 degrees. We'd essentially double the effective armor thickness without actually doubling the weight. And slow the turret traverse. Reduce visibility. Complicate repairs. Kraus wasn't arguing now, just thinking aloud. High Command would never approve it. Then we don't ask High Command. Klaus met his eyes. We do it ourselves, prove it works, and present them with results instead of theory. The depot fell quiet except for the distant sound of engines being tested, the metallic symphony of an army preparing for war. Kraus smoked his cigarette down to the filter, flicked it away, and made a decision that would alter history. Hauptmannsteiner's inspecting the southern depot today. Won't be back until tomorrow evening. He looked at Klaus hard. If you were to acquire some spare armor plates from the scrapyard and happen to spend tonight welding them to your tank, I might not notice until after it's done. At which point, there'd be no sense disassembling it without testing first. Klaus felt his pulse quicken. Hier Feldwebel. I'm not helping you. I'm not authorizing anything. I'm simply terrible at supervising my men. Kraus's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, the ghost of trenches and mustard gas, of watching friends die in machines that couldn't protect them. Don't make me regret this, Richter. I won't, Herr Feldwebel. I promise. By nightfall, Klaus had assembled his crew, gunner Werner Schmidt, driver Hans Muller, radio operator Paul Fischer, and loader Ludwig Beck. They stood in a circle of lamplight behind the tank, looking at Klaus's sketches like disciples studying sacred texts. You're insane, Werner said, but he was smiling. He was 19, from Hamburg, with hands steady enough to hit targets at 2,000 meters. This is completely insane. Insane is driving into combat in a metal box that French guns can penetrate like butter. Klaus spread the drawings across Panzer 411's rear deck. We have one night to make this work. Hans, I need you to calculate the new weight distribution and adjust the suspension accordingly. Paul, you're on measurements and cutting. Ludwig, you're my welder. Werner, you keep watch and make sure nobody official sees what we're doing. And if they do? Ludwig asked. He was 23, built like an ox, with welding experience from his father's workshop in the Ruhr. Then we all get court-martialed for unauthorized modification of Wehrmacht property. Klaus picked up a cutting torch. But we won't, because we're going to work fast and smart. Now let's move. What followed was a night Klaus would remember in fragments, like a fever dream reconstructed from sensation and shadow. The roar of cutting torches turning armor plates into component pieces. The shower of sparks as Ludwig welded with precision that belied his thick fingers. Hans underneath the tank, adjusting torsion bars and suspension elements while muttering calculations. Paul with his measuring tape and chalk, marking exact angles, double-checking everything. And Klaus moving between them like a conductor, solving problems, refining designs, his mind 3 steps ahead while his hands stayed anchored in the immediate task. The sloped plates took shape slowly, each one carefully angled, positioned to provide maximum deflection while minimizing weight and maintaining functionality. This is either brilliant or suicidal, Ludwig said around 3 in the morning, his face lit by the welding arc's hellish glow. Possibly both. Most brilliant things are. Klaus handed him another plate. How's the structural integrity? Solid. Better than I expected, actually. The angle distribution spreads the stress across the existing armor. It's like, Ludwig paused, searching for words. Like building a roof instead of a wall. The force slides off instead of hitting directly. Exactly. Klaus felt exhaustion pulling at him but pushed it back. 4 more plates and we're done. Dawn found them collapsed against the tank's tracks, covered in metal dust and welding burns, watching their creation emerge from the darkness as the sun rose. Panzer 411 looked different now, aggressive, predatory, with sloped plates that gave it a hunched, dangerous silhouette. Ugly, perhaps, but purposeful. It looks like something bit it and it grew armor to fight back, Werner observed. Good. Klaus pulled himself upright, every muscle screaming. Let's hope it fights like it looks. Hauptmann Steiner returned that evening to find Panzer 411 sitting in formation with the others, looking subtly wrong in ways he couldn't immediately identify. He circled the tank twice before stopping in front of Klaus, who stood at attention with his crew, all of them exhausted but defiant. Obergefreiter Richter. Steiner's voice was ice. Would you care to explain why your tank appears to have grown additional armor overnight? Struktural Reinforcement, Herr Hauptmann. To improve survivability against anti-tank fire. Unauthorized structural reinforcement. Yes, Herr Hauptmann. Steiner was 42, a veteran of the Great War's tank battles, with a scar running from his left eye to his jawline. He'd seen enough combat to know the difference between regulation and survival, but he'd also climbed high enough to know the cost of bucking the system. You could be court-martialed for this. Yes, Herr Hauptmann. You modified Wehrmacht property without permission, wasted materials, and potentially compromised this vehicle's combat effectiveness. Steiner walked around the tank again, and Klaus saw him studying the angles, the placement, the engineering. Or you've potentially saved your crew's lives and given us an advantage nobody anticipated. He stopped in front of Klaus again, and something shifted in his expression, not approval exactly, but recognition. We're conducting live-fire exercises tomorrow. Your tank participates. If the modifications fail, you're court-martialed. If they succeed, Steiner paused. We'll discuss what happens if they succeed. Dismissed. The live fire range sat in a valley 10 kilometers from the depot, where Wehrmacht engineers had constructed mock-ups of French fortifications and positioned captured anti-tank guns at measured distances. 12 Panzer IVs lined up for testing, and Panzer 411 sat at the end, different and dangerous and drawing stares from every crew. "They think we're idiots," Paul said through the intercom, his voice crackling with static. "I heard 2 crews betting on how fast we'll break down." "Let them bet." Klaus settled into the commander's position, feeling the tank around him like a second skin. "Werner, you have targets?" "Affirmative." 3 mock-up bunkers at 800, 1200 and 1500 meters. "Hans, engine status?" "Running smooth. The extra weight's noticeable but manageable. Suspension's holding better than expected." "Ludwig, Ammunition?" "Loaded and ready. Hoping we don't need to prove these modifications by getting shot, though." Klaus almost smiled. "That comes later. Today we just need to not fall apart." The exercises began. Standard Panzer IVs rumbled forward, firing at targets, maneuvering through obstacles, demonstrating the doctrine that would soon carry them into France. They performed well. The Panzer IV was a solid design, reliable, with a 75mm gun that could handle most threats. Then Panzer 411's turn came. "Forward," Klaus commanded, and Hans pushed the throttle. The tank lurched into motion, and immediately Klaus felt the difference. The extra weight sat low, gave them stability, made the ride feel grounded in ways the standard model didn't. They rolled through the course, Werner putting rounds through targets with his usual precision, Ludwig feeding shells in a rhythm perfected over months. But the real test came at the end, where engineers had positioned a captured French 47mm anti-tank gun loaded with practice rounds, solid shot that wouldn't penetrate armor but would demonstrate whether they could. "Stop at the marker," Klaus ordered. "Present turret at 45 degrees. Hans brought them to halt exactly where ordered, angling the tank so their modified turret faced the anti-tank gun. Klaus felt his crew tense, felt his own heartbeat accelerate. This was it, proof or humiliation. "Herr Hauptmann," Klaus called over the radio. "Permission to test armor effectiveness?" Steiner's voice crackled back. "Granted. God help you if this goes wrong." The anti-tank gun fired. Klaus saw the muzzle flash, heard the shell's supersonic crack, and then impact. The practice round hit their sloped turret armor with a sound like a church bell struck by lightning. But instead of punching through, instead of shattering welds or crumpling metal, the shell deflected. Ricocheted. Skipped off the 45-degree angle exactly as Klaus's mathematics had predicted and screamed away into the hillside. Inside the tank, nobody breathed. "Direct hit," Paul finally whispered. "We took a direct hit and it just bounced." "Again," Klaus commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Fire again." 3 more practice rounds. 3 more impacts. 3 more deflections. The sloped armor worked exactly as designed, turning lethal shots into glancing blows that left nothing but scars on steel. When the exercise ended, Klaus climbed out of the turret to find Hauptmann Steiner standing beside the tank, running his hand along the impact marks. The other crews had gathered too, whispers running through them like wind through grass. "Richter." Steiner's voice was quiet. "You just changed armored warfare." "Herr Hauptmann, Don't be modest. It's unbecoming." Steiner turned to face him. "How many tanks could you modify before the invasion begins?" Klaus blinked, recalculating timelines and resources in his head. "The invasion? Herr Hauptmann, I'm not authorized. You're now. As of this moment, you're detached to special assignment under my direct command. You'll have access to every welder, every piece of spare armor, every resource in this depot." Steiner's eyes were hard. "We have 6 weeks before Case Yellow begins." "How many tanks, Richter?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks until Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. 6 weeks to prove that his silly modification could change the outcome of the war. 80, Klaus said. "Maybe 90 if we work around the clock." "Then you'd better start now." What followed was a blur of motion that made Klaus's single-night modification look leisurely. Steiner secured authorization from higher command, framing it as field adaptations for combat effectiveness, without mentioning that the design came from an Oberstfreiter with no formal engineering training. The depot transformed into a production line, 3 shifts running 24 hours, welders working side by side while Klaus moved between them like a ghost, checking angles, ensuring quality, solving problems before they became failures. His crew became instructors. Werner taught other gunners how to account for the modified sight lines. Hans trained drivers on handling the new weight distribution. Ludwig supervised welding teams, his standards so exacting that 3 experienced welders quit rather than meet them. Paul coordinated materials and logistics, somehow always finding the exact components needed exactly when needed. Other soldiers thought they were insane. Officers whispered about Richter's folly, becoming official doctrine. But every night, another 3 tanks rolled out wearing sloped armor, ugly and deadly and ready for war. On the 4th week, Oberst Heinrich Guderian arrived unannounced. Klaus was underneath Panzer 437, checking suspension modifications, when boots appeared beside his face. Expensive boots, polished to mirror brightness, attached to legs wearing the rank insignia of a full colonel. Oberstfreiter Richter, I presume? Klaus rolled out from under the tank, scrambled to attention, and found himself facing the man who would soon become known as Heinz the Swift, the architect of blitzkrieg warfare. Guderian was 44, with cold blue eyes that catalogued everything and revealed nothing. Herr Oberst. At ease. Guderian walked around the modified tank, studying it with the intensity of someone whose career depended on understanding innovation. I've read Hauptmann Steiner's reports. Sloped armor. Deflection geometry. Unauthorized modifications that somehow increased combat effectiveness by an estimated 40%. Is that accurate? Aye, that's Hauptmann Steiner's assessment, Herr Oberst. I only designed the modifications. Only. Guderian turned to face him. Do you understand what you've done, Richter? The French have more tanks than we do. Better tanks in some respects. The Char B1 has armor we can't penetrate frontally. Our doctrine relies on speed and coordination, on avoiding direct combat when possible. But you've given us tanks that can stand and fight. That changes everything. Klaus had been so focused on the immediate work, on meeting the deadline, that he hadn't considered the strategic implications. Hadn't thought about how his modifications might shift the balance of an entire campaign. I just wanted to protect my crew, Herr Oberst. And in doing so, you may have protected all of Germany. Guderian's expression remained neutral. I'm accelerating case yellow by 1 week. We invade France and the Low Countries on May 10th. Can you have your modifications completed by then? May 10th, 23 days away. They'd modified 67 tanks so far, with 30 more in various stages of completion. Yes, Herr Oberst. We'll be ready. Guderian nodded once, started to leave, then paused. Richter. After this is over, assuming we win, I want you in Berlin. The Waffenamt needs innovators who understand practical application, not just theory. Consider it in order. He left, and Klaus stood staring after him, understanding finally catching up to action. His silly modification had attracted the attention of the man who would lead the armored spearhead into France. Had become a fundamental component of German war planning. Had transformed from a desperate attempt to protect 5 men into a strategic weapon. We're part of history now, Werner said, appearing beside him. Can't go back. No, Klaus agreed quietly. We can't. The remaining days blurred together. 93 tanks ultimately received the modifications, every Panzer IV in their sector, each one transformed into something more dangerous than its designers had intended. Klaus barely slept, barely ate, his entire existence compressed into angles and welds and quality inspections. But finally, on May 8, 1940, Hauptmann Steiner inspected the last tank and declared them ready for war. 93 modified Panzer IVs, Steiner said, standing in the depot with Klaus and his crew. 93 tanks that can withstand punishment that would destroy standard models. Do you understand what you've accomplished? Klaus looked at the rows of modified tanks, their sloped armor catching the setting sun. We gave them a fighting chance, Herr Hauptmann. You gave us an advantage. Steiner extended his hand. Whatever happens in France, remember that. Remember that you made a difference. They shook, and Klaus felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his bones. Tomorrow they would load these tanks onto trains. In 2 days, they would roll across the border into Luxembourg and Belgium. And then they would discover if his mathematics translated to survival in real combat. May 10, 1940, dawned cold and clear. Klaus stood in the commander's position of Panzer 411, watching the Belgian border through his periscope as German artillery began the barrage that would announce Case Yellow to the world. Around him, the modified Panzer IVs of the 7th Panzer Division waited like coiled springs, their engines rumbling, their crews tense with anticipation. All units. Guderian's voice crackled over the radio. Execute. 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 And they rolled forward into history. The first week was chaos. German armored columns punched through Belgian defenses, bypassed the Maginot Line entirely by going around it, and drove deep into France faster than Allied commanders thought possible. Klaus's modified Panzer IVs led the way, their sloped armor turning ambush points into massacres for the defenders. The first real test came on May 14th, at a crossroads outside Sedan. French armor had established a defensive position, 6 Char B-1 heavy tanks, their 75mm guns and thick armor making them nearly invincible by standard Wehrmacht calculations. The French commander positioned them to block the road, confident that German Panzer IVs would have to retreat or be destroyed. Targets identified, Werner reported, his voice steady. 6 heavy tanks, entrenched position. They have the advantage. Klaus studied the tactical situation, his mind running calculations. Standard doctrine said retreat, call for air support, bypass if possible. But they were the tip of the spearhead. Every minute they delayed cost momentum. All modified panzers, advance in line formation, Klaus commanded. Present sloped armor. Engage at 800 meters. Klaus, those are Char B-1s, Hans said. Their armor. Their guns are 75mm firing at favorable angles. Our armor is effectively doubled by the sloping. We can take hits they can't. Klaus keyed the radio. Trust the modifications. Trust the mathematics. All units, advance. 14 modified Panzer IVs rolled forward. The French opened fire immediately, their 75mm guns thundering, shells screaming across the battlefield. Klaus watched through his periscope as rounds impacted his armor and deflected, ricocheted, bounced away in screaming arcs of frustrated kinetic energy. We're taking hits, Paul shouted. Multiple impacts. And they're not penetrating, Klaus replied. Werner, return fire. Target their tracks, their vision ports. Disable and destroy. The modified panzers kept advancing, kept firing, their sloped armor turning what should have been a massacre into a grinding advance. French shells that would have destroyed standard Panzer IVs instead skipped off the angled plates, and slowly, inevitably, the German guns found their marks. 1 Char B-1 brewed up, its ammunition cooking off in a pillar of flame. Then another. The French crews, trained to fight an enemy that would retreat from their superior armor, found themselves facing tanks that refused to die, that absorbed punishment and kept coming. Panic spread. The remaining Char B-1s tried to retreat, but their tracks had been damaged, and German fire found them one by one. 20 minutes after the engagement began, all 6 French heavy tanks were burning wrecks, and the modified Panzer IVs had suffered only superficial damage. Not a single German crew killed. Not a single tank disabled. Did we just? Ludwig's voice was hollow with disbelief. Did we just destroy 6 Char B-1s without losses? Yes, Klaus said quietly. We did. The radio erupted with chatter, other units wanting to know how they'd survived, commanders demanding tactical reports, Guderian himself calling for confirmation. Word spread through the Wehrmacht like wildfire. The modified Panzer IVs were nearly invincible, could stand against French heavy armor and win. But Klaus felt no triumph. only the weight of understanding what he'd unleashed. The French campaign became a cascade of victories that felt increasingly hollow. The modified Panzer IV's spearheaded drives that sliced through French defenses, their sloped armor allowing aggressive tactics that would have been suicidal with standard tanks. Klaus's crew fought in 14 major engagements over 28 days, took hundreds of hits, and never suffered a penetrating wound. Other crews weren't as fortunate. Ludwig was killed on May 23 when a lucky French shot found a gap in the armor. They buried him in Belgium, in soil that would grow crops that would feed people who would never know his name. Klaus promoted a replacement loader and kept fighting because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant confronting what he'd done. By June 14, German forces entered Paris. By June 22, France signed the armistice in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918. 6 weeks. The campaign everyone predicted would take months, would cost hundreds of thousands of lives, had ended in 6 weeks with shockingly low German casualties. And Klaus Richter's silly modification had been instrumental in that success. The propaganda machine celebrated German engineering superiority. Newsreels showed modified Panzer IVs rolling through Paris, their sloped armor gleaming. Goebbels himself mentioned innovative field modifications in a radio address. But nobody named Klaus. Nobody credited the Oberstreiter who'd welded extra plates in the middle of the night. Which was fine by Klaus. He didn't want credit. He wanted Ludwig back. He wanted to unsee the hundreds of burning French tanks, the thousands of prisoners, the occupation of a nation. "You're a hero," Werner said one evening in July, after they'd returned to Germany. "The entire Panzerwaffe is adopting sloped armor as standard. You changed warfare. I helped conquer a country." Klaus stared at his hands, still stained with grease, now also stained with implications he couldn't wash away. That's not heroism. It's survival. We're soldiers. We follow orders. You just made following those orders less likely to kill us. And more likely to kill them. Klaus looked at Werner, this gunner who'd put shells through French tanks with mechanical precision. "Don't you see? I didn't just protect German crews. I made German tanks more lethal, more effective. I helped the Wehrmacht overrun France in 6 weeks instead of 6 months. How many people died because we were too efficient? How many French soldiers, civilians, people who'd still be alive if we'd been slower?" Werner had no answer. Nobody did. The summons to Berlin came in August. Klaus traveled by train, watching Germany slip past his window. Farms and factories, cities rebuilding from the previous war, children playing in streets that would soon send them to fight. The Waffenamt occupied a massive complex in the city center, all concrete efficiency and military precision. Oberstreiter Richter, reporting as ordered. The officer behind the desk was a colonel Klaus didn't recognize, with the calculating eyes of someone who measured people's value in tactical advantages. "At ease, Richter. Or should I say Lieutenant Richter?" Klaus blinked. "Sir? You've been promoted. Commissioned." Guderian himself pushed it through. The colonel slid papers across the desk. "You're being assigned to the Waffenamt's Advanced Development Division. Your job is to do for other weapons what you did for the Panzer IV, find practical improvements that increase combat effectiveness." "Sir, I'm just a mechanic." "You're the mechanic who changed armored warfare with a welding torch and basic geometry. That makes you more valuable than 100 engineers with doctorates." The colonel's expression hardened. "Germany is at war with the world. We need every advantage, every innovation. You proved you can deliver those advantages. Now you'll do it again. And again. Until we win or until you can't anymore." Klaus looked at the commission papers, at the promotion that should have felt like an honor but tasted like ash. "And if I refuse? Then you return to your unit and fight with the tanks you modified. And when those tanks roll into the next country, and the next, you'll know that your innovation made it possible." The colonel leaned forward. "There's no refusing, Lieutenant. There's only choosing where you contribute to the war effort. Here, where you might save German lives. Or in a tank, where you'll help take others." It wasn't a choice. It was an acknowledgement that he'd never had a choice, that the moment he'd welded that first armor plate, he'd committed himself to the trajectory of the war. I'll take the assignment, sir. But report to Department 4 tomorrow morning. And Richter? The colonel's voice softened slightly. What you did took courage. Not the kind they give medals for, but the kind that actually matters. Remember that. Klaus worked in Berlin for the next 3 years. Designed modifications for tanks, for aircraft, for weapon systems he'd never imagined. Every innovation that increased German combat effectiveness, that saved German soldiers, that helped the Wehrmacht conquer more territory. He was good at it, too good. His practical approach, his focus on field modifications over theoretical perfection, made him invaluable. But every night, Klaus dreamed of burning French tanks. Of Ludwig dying in Belgium. Of the railway car where France surrendered and the weight of his contribution to that surrender. In 1943, Werner visited him in Berlin. The young gunner had been promoted to Panzer commander, had fought in North Africa and Russia, had accumulated decorations and scars in equal measure. You look terrible, Werner said, finding Klaus in his office at 2 a.m, surrounded by blueprints and cold coffee. I feel terrible. Klaus didn't look up from his work. This is a modified suspension system for the Panther. It'll increase cross-country speed by 8%. How many more kilometers of Russia will that let us conquer? Klaus. I can't stop, Werner. If I stop, if I think about what I'm doing, about what I did with those first modifications, Klaus's hands trembled. I just keep working. Keep solving problems. Because if I'm valuable enough, maybe they'll let me keep doing this instead of sending me back to fight. And I can't fight anymore. Can't climb into a tank knowing I helped make them into more efficient killing machines. Werner sat down across from him, this friend who'd shared a tank and a dream and a night of welding that changed everything. None of us can change what we did. What we are. The war doesn't care about our guilt. It just keeps grinding forward. Does it ever end? The guilt? I don't know. I hope so. But probably not. Werner stood to leave, paused at the door. For what it's worth, Klaus, you saved my life probably 50 times over with those modifications. I'd be dead if you hadn't made our tank nearly invincible. Whatever else you did, whatever else it cost, you kept your crew alive. That has to count for something. After he left, Klaus returned to his blueprints. Because Werner was right, the war didn't care about guilt. It only cared about innovation, efficiency, victory at any cost. And Klaus Richter, the mechanic who'd changed armored warfare with a silly modification, would keep contributing to that victory until the war finally ended. One way or another. The war ended on May 8, 1945, exactly 5 years after Klaus's modified Panzer IVs had rolled into Belgium. But this time, Germany was the one signing surrender documents. Berlin liegt in Ruins. The Wehrmacht had been destroyed. And Klaus Richter sat in a cell waiting for Allied interrogators, surrounded by the wreckage of everything his innovations had helped build. The American officer who interviewed him was a captain named James Morrison, an engineer before the war, with eyes that understood the space between intention and consequence. Lieutenant Richter. You're the one who developed the sloped armor modifications for the Panzer IV. Yes. That modification changed the French campaign. Made German tanks significantly more effective, probably shortened the war in the West by months. Morrison consulted his notes. Saved thousands of German lives. Cost thousands of Allied ones. How do you feel about that? Klaus had prepared himself for this question for 5 years. I feel like a mechanic who solved a problem without considering the implications. I wanted to protect my crew. I succeeded. And in succeeding, I helped Germany conquer France, helped enable everything that came after. I can't undo it. Can't even justify it. I can only acknowledge what I did and accept the consequences. Morrison studied him for a long moment. You know what's interesting, Lieutenant? After we captured your modification designs, we analyzed them. The principles were sound, so sound that we're incorporating similar concepts into our post-war tank development. Your silly idea that High Command almost court-martialed you for? It's now considered fundamental to armored warfare. That doesn't make me feel better. It's not supposed to. It's supposed to make you understand that innovation doesn't have morality. A welded armor plate doesn't care who it protects or what cause it serves. It just deflects shells according to physics. Morrison closed his folder. You're not being charged as a war criminal. Your innovations, while effective, weren't inherently criminal. You'll be processed as a regular POW and released. What you do after that is your choice. Klaus was released 3 months later, returning to Bavaria to find his family farm bombed, his parents dead, his younger brother killed on the Eastern Front. He rebuilt the farm slowly, working soil that had grown crops for 3 centuries, trying to wash the grease from his hands with honest labor. But word spread. Engineers heard about the mechanic who'd revolutionized armor design. Companies, first German, then American, then Soviet, approached him with job offers. Help us design the next generation of tanks. Teach us your methods. Share your expertise. Klaus refused them all. Spent his days farming, his nights reading, his quiet hours walking hills that didn't care about wars or innovations or guilt. Until 1951, when a letter arrived from America. Mr. Richter, my name is James Morrison. We met briefly in 1945. I'm now working for the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department, helping design the next generation of American armored vehicles. I'm not going to ask you to build weapons. I'm asking you to help us build protection. The world hasn't stopped fighting. Korea, the Cold War, regional conflicts everywhere. And soldiers are still dying in tanks that can't adequately protect them. Your sloped armor innovations saved lives on both sides once people understood its principles. I'm asking you to do it again, not for Germany or America or any nation, but for the soldiers who crew these machines. They deserve the best protection we can give them. Think about it. If you're interested, contact me at the address below. Respectfully, James Morrison. Klaus read the letter 3 times. Thought about Ludwig dying in Belgium. About Werner surviving because of sloped armor. About French tankers burning and German tankers living and the mathematics that didn't distinguish between them. He wrote back 2 weeks later. Captain Morrison, I'll help. But on 3 conditions. First, any designs I create must be shared with all NATO forces. No national exclusivity. Protection shouldn't be a competitive advantage. Second, I work on defensive systems only. No weapons, no offensive capabilities. Only armor and survivability. Third, you never call me a hero. I'm a mechanic who made a modification. That's all I've ever been. If you can accept those terms, I'll take the next ship to America. Klaus Richter. Morrison accepted. Klaus spent the next 20 years working for various defense contractors, always on protection, always on survivability. His principles of sloped armor became standard on the M48 Patton, the M60, eventually the M1 Abrams. Soviet designers studied his work, incorporated it into the T-54 and T-55. British chieftains, French AMX-30s, Israeli Merkavas, every modern tank owed something to that night in March 1940 when a desperate mechanic welded extra plates at 45-degree angles. But Klaus never forgot the cost. Never let himself believe that saving lives erased taking them. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, he watched news footage of Israeli tanks using armor principles he'd developed, destroying Egyptian and Syrian forces. Tanks on both sides incorporated his innovations, which meant his mathematics was killing people on both sides simultaneously. Does it ever get easier? He asked Morrison, who'd become a friend over the decades. They sat in Klaus's small apartment in Detroit, watching the war unfold on a black and white television. Knowing that your work protects some while enabling the destruction of others? Morrison was 62 now, gray-haired, with grandchildren who would never know how many lives their grandfather's engineering decisions had affected. No. But I've learned to measure differently. Not in lives saved versus lives lost, but in whether the alternative would have been worse. And if there was no good alternative, then you accept that you did your best with impossible choices, and you keep trying to tip the balance toward protection rather than destruction. Morrison poured them both whiskey. You spent 27 years designing better protection. How many tank crews survived because of your work who would have died otherwise? Thousands? Tens of thousands? And how many died because German tanks with my modifications were more effective in France, in Russia, in North Africa? You can't calculate that equation, Klaus. It's not mathematics, it's philosophy, morality, impossible questions with no right answers. Morrison raised his glass. All I know is that every tank designer since 1940 has studied your work. Every crew that survives a hit to sloped armor owes you a debt they'll never know to repay. That has to count for something. Klaus drank, the whiskey burning familiar paths down his throat. I hope so. I really do. The letter from Werner arrived in 1973, forwarded through military channels and old connections. Klaus hadn't heard from his former gunner in 15 years, and the handwriting was shaky, uncertain. I don't know if this will reach you. I don't know if you want to hear from me after all these years. But I'm dying, cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, and there are things that need to be said before I go. I never thanked you properly for keeping us alive. For that night of welding, for the modifications that saved my life probably 100 times over. I came home from the war. Got married. Had 3 children, now 5 grandchildren. I've lived 59 years, and 45 of them wouldn't have existed without your silly modification. But I also need to tell you something else. It wasn't your fault. The war, the conquest, the occupation, none of it was your fault. We were soldiers following orders in a system we couldn't control. You tried to save lives. That the regime used your innovation for their purposes doesn't make you responsible for their crimes. I've carried my own guilt, every French tank I destroyed, every town we occupied, every order I followed. But I've also tried to live well, to raise good children, to make the years you gave me count for something. That's all any of us can do, acknowledge what we did, accept what we can't change, and try to make whatever time we have left matter. Thank you, Klaus. 4 Panzer 411. For that night in March 1940. For giving me decades I wouldn't have had otherwise. Your friend, Werner Schmidt. Klaus read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer beside the original sketches of the sloped armor modifications. Sketches he'd kept for 33 years, unable to throw away, unable to display. He wrote back immediately. Werner. Thank you. For your friendship, for your crew, for understanding what I've never been able to articulate, that we did what we thought was right in a situation where nothing was entirely right. I'm sorry you're sick. I'm grateful you had those 45 years. I'm honored that you credit me with giving them to you, even though I credit you with helping make the modifications work. You were right that night in Berlin. The guilt probably never ends. But maybe that's appropriate. Maybe we're supposed to carry it, to remember what our innovations cost even as we acknowledge what they achieved. I hope your remaining time is peaceful. I hope your grandchildren know they had a grandfather worth knowing. Thank you for writing. Thank you for everything. Klaus. Werner died 4 months later. Klaus received the notice from Werner's son, along with a photograph. Werner surrounded by family, smiling despite the illness, surrounded by the life that Klaus's modification had helped make possible. Klaus framed the photograph and hung it in his workshop, beside the sketches. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Klaus watched on television as Germans danced on the wall, as East and West reunited, as the world he'd helped shape through 60 years of armored warfare transformed again. He was 74 years old, still working part-time as a consultant, still trying to improve protection systems, still carrying the weight of March 1940. That Christmas, he received an unexpected visitor. The young woman who knocked on his door was 32, with Werner's eyes and a determined expression. Mr. Richter? I'm Anna Schmidt. Werner was my grandfather. Klaus invited her in, made coffee, waited. My grandfather talked about you a lot before he died. About Panzer 411, about the modifications, about the crew that became family. Anna pulled out a worn notebook. He kept a journal throughout the war. I've been reading it, trying to understand who he was, what he did. And I found this entry from March 1940. She opened the notebook to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Werner's handwriting, young and enthusiastic. Klaus Richter is either brilliant or insane. Maybe both. He's modifying our tank with his own design, sloped armor that he says will deflect shells instead of letting them penetrate. If it works, we might actually survive this war. If it fails, we'll all be court-martialed. But I believe in him. He's not doing this for glory or recognition. He's doing it because he can't stand the thought of his crew dying in a metal box that doesn't protect them adequately. That's the kind of man you want making decisions about your survival. Anna looked up, her eyes wet. You gave my grandfather 59 years. Which means you gave my father his father. Which means you gave me my grandfather. I have memories of him teaching me to ride a bicycle, to fish, to think about the world. I wouldn't exist without those modifications you made. Klaus felt something break open in his chest. Not absolution, exactly, but acknowledgement. I also helped German tanks conquer France. Helped enable everything that came after. The good doesn't erase the bad, Anna. No. But the bad doesn't erase the good either. She closed the journal carefully. My grandfather lived with guilt for what he did in the war. But he also lived, really lived, raised a family, built a business, helped rebuild Germany into something better than what it was. Those 45 extra years? He made them count. And that's partly thanks to you. After she left, Klaus sat in his workshop surrounded by decades of designs and modifications, thinking about Werner's journal entry, about Anna's gratitude, about the impossible mathematics of measuring value against cost. He picked up a pencil and began to sketch. Not armor this time, but safety systems for civilian vehicles, crumple zones, reinforced passenger compartments, innovations that would protect without enabling destruction. At 74, he was finally designing things with no military application whatsoever. It felt like coming home. Klaus Richter died in 1998 at the age of 83. His obituary in the Detroit Free Press mentioned his work on armored vehicle protection but didn't name him as the inventor of sloped armor principles. Which was exactly how he wanted it. But at his memorial service, attended by a surprisingly large crowd, 3 people spoke about the man he'd been. James Morrison, now 92, spoke about collaboration and friendship. Klaus Richter spent 27 years trying to protect soldiers from the consequences of war. He succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. But more importantly, he did it with humility, with conscience, with constant awareness of the cost of innovation. He was the best engineer I ever met, and the most moral. Anna Schmidt, representing her family, spoke about legacy. My grandfather lived 45 years because of Klaus Richter's modification. My father lived his entire life because of it. I exist because of it. Klaus carried guilt for how his innovation was used. But he also gave generations of families the gift of time together. That matters. That will always matter. And finally, surprisingly, a retired French tank commander named Pierre Beaumont spoke about reconciliation. He was 81, had fought in the defense of France in 1940, had been captured after his Char B-1 was destroyed by modified German Panzer IVs. I spent 58 years hating the man who designed the armor that helped defeat France. Hating Klaus Richter without ever meeting him, without knowing him, because I needed someone to blame for what happened to my country. Beaumont's voice was rough with age and emotion. But 5 years ago, I learned that the same principles that defeated France also saved my son's life in the Gulf War. He was a tank commander in a French AMX-30, and he survived a direct hit that should have killed him because of sloped armor designed by the man I'd spent decades hating. He paused, wiping his eyes. Klaus Richter didn't start the war. Didn't choose how his innovation would be used. He just tried to solve a problem, how to protect people in machines designed to kill and be killed. That he succeeded, that his solution transcended the politics and hatred of the moment to become a fundamental principle of protection, that's not something to hate. That's something to honor. After the service, Morrison found Anna standing beside Klaus's casket, studying the photograph they'd included, Klaus at 24, standing beside Panzer 411 in March 1940, looking young and uncertain and determined. He never forgave himself, Morrison said quietly. For France, for the campaign, for how effective his modifications were. I know. Anna touched the photograph gently. But maybe that's why he spent the rest of his life trying to protect people. Maybe the guilt was what drove him to be so good at it. Maybe. Or maybe he was just a mechanic who solved a problem and spent 60 years trying to live with the consequences. Morrison looked at the photograph too, at this young German soldier who'd changed warfare with a welding torch and basic geometry. Either way, he mattered. His work saved lives. That has to count for something. It does, Anna said. It counts for everything. 10 years after Klaus's death, his workshop notes were donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The original sketches of the sloped armor modifications went on display in an exhibit about innovation in warfare, alongside the letter from Werner and the photograph of Anna's family. A small placard explained, in March 1940, Oberstfreiter Klaus Richter modified a Panzer IV tank with sloped armor plates, creating a design principle that would revolutionize armored warfare and become standard on virtually every tank design since. His innovation, born from a desire to protect his crew, ultimately saved countless lives on all sides of modern conflicts. Richter spent the remainder of his career developing protective systems for military vehicles, always focusing on defense rather than offense, always aware of both the power and the responsibility of innovation. Students studying engineering ethics often visit the exhibit. They study the sketches, read Werner's journal entry, learn about a mechanic who changed the world with a seemingly silly modification and spent the rest of his life trying to balance the scales between protection and destruction. And sometimes, late at night when the museum is closed, if you stand in front of Klaus Richter's original sketches and listen carefully, you can almost hear the sound of a welding torch in a depot outside Koblenz, sparks flying in the darkness as 5 men work through the night to solve an impossible problem. They're building protection, building survival, building a modification that will echo through history in ways they can't imagine. And in that moment, before the war begins, before the consequences unfold, before guilt and gratitude become intertwined, they're just doing their best with the knowledge they have, trying to keep each other alive in a world that's about to demand everything from them. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. And sometimes, against all odds, it's enough. But the story doesn't end in a museum. Stories never really end. They echo forward through generations, through decisions made by people who never knew the original actors, through consequences that ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. In 2015, a young engineering student named Sarah Richter stood in the Smithsonian, staring at her great-grandfather's sketches. She was 23, studying mechanical engineering at MIT, and had grown up knowing only fragments of Klaus's story, that he'd worked on tanks during the war, that he'd immigrated to America afterward, that he'd spent his life designing protective systems. "Your great-grandfather was quite the innovator," said Professor David Chin, her thesis advisor, who'd accompanied her to Washington for a conference. The sloped armor principle is still taught in every armor design course. Basic, elegant, revolutionary. "He never talked about it," Sarah said quietly. "My grandfather, Klaus's son, said he'd change the subject whenever anyone mentioned the war. Like it caused him physical pain to remember." Probably did. Chen studied the sketches with professional appreciation. Innovation always has consequences. Your great-grandfathers were just more visible than most. Every tank designer since 1940 stands on his shoulders, but he stood on a foundation of choices he never wanted to make. Sarah read the placard again, then the displayed letter from Werner Schmidt. "This Werner, my grandfather mentioned him once. Said he visited our house in Detroit when I was a baby, before he died. Said he and Klaus would sit for hours not talking, just being together, 2 old men who shared something nobody else could understand. Shared trauma. Shared guilt. Shared survival." Chin glanced at his watch. "Your presentation's in 2 hours. We should head back to the hotel." But Sarah couldn't move. Something about the sketches held her. The precision of the angles, the careful notations, the evidence of a mind working frantically to solve a problem. This was her blood, her lineage, the genetic inheritance of someone who'd changed history by welding metal in the darkness. "Professor Chin, my thesis is on modular armor systems for humanitarian vehicles. Aid trucks, ambulances, equipment that needs protection in conflict zones but isn't military. I know. It's excellent work. I just realized why I chose that topic." Sarah touched the glass case gently. I'm trying to finish what he started. Protection without weaponization. Defense without enabling offense. He spent 60 years trying to balance scales that couldn't be balanced. Maybe I can tip them a little further toward protection. Chen smiled. Maybe you can. That would be a worthy legacy. That night, after her presentation, Sarah called her grandfather. Martin Richter was 82, living in a retirement community in Arizona, his voice still strong despite age. Grandfather, I'm at the Smithsonian. I saw great-grandfather Klaus's sketches. His modifications. A long pause. I haven't seen those in years. Didn't want to really. Too many complicated feelings. Tell me about him. Not the engineer, the man. Another pause, longer. Then, he was kind. That's what I remember most. Despite everything, despite the weight he carried, he was genuinely kind to people. He'd help neighbors fix their cars for free, would spend hours teaching kids in the neighborhood about basic mechanics. Never raised his voice, never talked about his work unless asked directly. Did he ever talk about the war? Only once, when I was 18 and about to be drafted for Vietnam. He sat me down, looked me in the eye, and said, Martin, if you go to war, remember that every choice you make has consequences you can't predict. Do your duty, protect your friends, but never forget that the enemy soldiers are also someone's sons. And if you survive, spend the rest of your life trying to make that survival mean something. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks. That's beautiful. It was also terrifying, because I could hear in his voice that he was speaking from experience, from decades of wrestling with exactly those questions. He never found peace, Sarah. Never forgave himself. But he tried, God, he tried so hard to make the years count for something. I'm designing protective systems for humanitarian vehicles. For my thesis. Martin's voice softened. He would have loved that. Would have helped you, would have been so proud. He always said the best engineering protects the vulnerable without empowering the violent. Sounds like you understand that. After they hung up, Sarah returned to her hotel room and opened her laptop. Her thesis needed revision, not the technical work, which was sound, but the introduction. She needed to explain why this work mattered, why protection without weaponization represented more than just engineering design. She began to write. This thesis is dedicated to my great-grandfather, Klaus Richter, who taught me, though we never met, that innovation carries responsibility, that protection is a moral imperative, and that the true measure of engineering excellence is not what we build, but who we protect in building it. 6 months later, Sarah's thesis won MIT's Mechanical Engineering Department's top honors. The design, modular armor panels that could be rapidly installed on civilian vehicles, using lightweight composite materials and, yes, sloped angles to maximize deflection, was exactly what she'd envisioned. Protection without militarization. Defense without offense. 3 humanitarian organizations immediately expressed interest in implementing the design. Doctors Without Borders wanted it for their ambulances in Syria. The International Red Cross wanted it for supply trucks in South Sudan. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees wanted it for convoy vehicles in Yemen. Sarah found herself in meetings with people who worked in war zones, who understood threat profiles and attack patterns, who'd lost colleagues to roadside bombs and small arms fire. And as she explained her designs, she heard echoes of Klaus. The same focus on practical protection, the same insistence on field testing over theoretical perfection, the same awareness that every design choice mattered because lives depended on it. Your panels would have saved 3 of our team last year, said Dr. Maria Gonzalez, who ran medical missions in conflict zones. An ambush outside Aleppo. Our ambulance took small arms fire. The driver survived, but 2 nurses in the back didn't. Your design would have deflected those rounds. Sarah felt the weight settle into her chest, the same weight Klaus had carried. Success measured in lives saved meant failure measured in lives that could have been saved earlier. The mathematics of protection never balanced cleanly. We'll get the design into production as fast as possible, Sarah promised. Over the next 3 years, Sarah's modular armor system was installed on 847 humanitarian vehicles operating in 17 conflict zones. The design saved documented lives, 43 people who survived attacks that would have killed them otherwise. Medical personnel, aid workers, refugees being transported to safety. But Sarah also learned what Klaus had learned, that protection enabled presence, and presence in conflict zones had its own complicated morality. Aid workers who survived attacks continued working in war zones, which meant they remained exposed to danger. Was saving them once enough if they just faced the same threats again? These were the questions that woke her at 3 in the morning, that made her understand why Klaus had carried his weight in silence. In 2018, Sarah traveled to Germany for an engineering conference. She took an extra week, rented a car, and drove to Bavaria, to the farm where Klaus had grown up, where he'd returned after the war, where he'd tried to wash the grease from his hands with honest labor. The farm still existed, though different families owned it now. The current residents, the Hoffmans, were gracious when Sarah explained who she was and why she'd come. "We know the history," Frau Hoffman said, leading Sarah through the property. "When we bought the land, the previous owners mentioned that Klaus Richter had lived here, had rebuilt after the bombing. There's still some of his workshop equipment in the old barn, if you want to see it." The barn smelled of hay and age and the ghosts of machinery. In the back corner, covered in dust, Sarah found tools that Klaus had used, wrenches, measuring instruments, a welding mask so old it belonged in a museum. She picked up the welding mask, felt the weight of it, imagined her great-grandfather wearing this exact piece of equipment that night in March 1940. He never escaped it, did he? Sarah said to herself. The war. The modifications. The consequences. He carried it from that depot in Koblenz to Detroit to this barn, and it never let him go. Is that such a bad thing? Her Hoffman had followed her into the barn. Carrying the weight, maybe some things should weigh on us. Maybe that's how we remember to be careful, to think about consequences before we act. Sarah set the welding mask down carefully. Maybe, but it seems like such a heavy burden for one person to carry alone. Perhaps. But he didn't carry it alone, did he? He had Werner. He had James Morrison. He had family, friends, colleagues who understood. And now he has you, great-granddaughter, who's continuing his work, trying to tip those scales a little further toward protection. That's not carrying the burden alone. That's sharing it across generations. That night, Sarah sat in a small hotel in Munich and wrote a letter she could never send. Dear great-grandfather Klaus, I saw your sketches today. Your workshop tools. The evidence of a life spent trying to balance impossible equations. I understand now why you never talked about the war. Why you changed the subject. Why you carried silence like armor. Because there are no words adequate to explain innovation that saves and kills simultaneously, protection that enables destruction, mathematics that measure lives against lives. But I want you to know, your work mattered. Not just the sloped armor, though that changed warfare and saved countless soldiers. But the decades afterward, the focus on protection, the refusal to weaponize, the constant effort to make engineering serve life instead of death. That mattered even more. I'm trying to continue that work. Trying to build protection that doesn't enable violence, defense that doesn't require offense. It's harder than it sounds. Every design choice has implications I can't fully predict. Every success means I could have done it sooner. Every failure means someone dies who might have lived. I understand why you carried guilt until the end. But I hope you also knew that you succeeded, not perfectly, because perfection isn't possible in war or engineering or life. But genuinely. You protected people. You saved lives. You spent 60 years trying to make your initial innovation mean something beyond conquest. That counts. It counted then. It counts now. It will count forever. Thank you for the example. Thank you for the burden. Thank you for showing me that carrying weight is sometimes the most important thing we can do. Your great-granddaughter, sir. She folded the letter, placed it in her journal, and carried it with her as reminder and promise. By 2023, Sarah's humanitarian armor systems had been installed on over 3,000 vehicles. The documented saves had grown to 247 lives. People who survived ambushes, attacks, accidents that would have killed them without the protection. Aid workers, medical personnel, journalists, refugees, local staff working with international organizations. Sarah kept a list. Not to celebrate, but to remember. Each name represented someone who'd gone home to family, who'd had another day, another year, another chance. But each name also reminded her that protection enabled risk, that these same people would face danger again tomorrow, and her armor might not be enough next time. "You're too much like your great-grandfather," her mother said during a video call. "You carry this work like penance instead of accomplishment." "Maybe I should." Sarah was in her office at the humanitarian engineering firm she'd co-founded, surrounded by designs and threat assessments and photographs of vehicles that had saved lives. Protection sounds noble until you realize it enables people to stay in dangerous situations instead of leaving. But leaving isn't always an option. Someone has to help in conflict zones. Someone has to deliver medical care, food, shelter to people trapped in war. Your armor lets them do that with less risk. That's not enabling danger, that's enabling humanity. Sarah wanted to believe that. Some days she did believe it. Other days she understood exactly why Klaus had spent nights walking Bavarian hills, trying to outpace the wait. The invitation arrived in 2024. The German government was hosting a commemoration of the 80th anniversary of various World War II events, including a small ceremony honoring technical innovations that shaped modern warfare, both Allied and Axis, acknowledging both the advancement and the cost. Klaus Richter's sloped armor modifications would be featured. They wanted Sarah to attend, to speak about her great-grandfather's legacy and her own work continuing his principles. She almost declined. The thought of standing before an audience and talking about Klaus's innovations, knowing they'd helped Germany conquer France, knowing they'd killed as well as saved, felt like exploitation. Like turning complicated morality into simple narrative. But her grandfather Martin, now 91 and increasingly fragile, asked her to go. Klaus never wanted recognition, Martin said during one of their weekly calls. But he also never wanted his work reduced to just the 6 weeks in France. He spent 60 years trying to demonstrate that protection mattered more than conquest. If you can tell that story, the whole story, not just the dramatic part, then maybe his legacy becomes more than just sloped armor on tanks. So Sarah went to Berlin, stood before an audience of engineers and historians and military personnel from a dozen nations, and told Klaus's story. Not as triumph or tragedy, but as complicated truth. My great-grandfather, Klaus Richter, made a modification that changed armored warfare. But more importantly, he spent the next 60 years wrestling with the implications of that change, trying to ensure that protection, not destruction, defined his life's work. He succeeded in ways that don't fit neatly into historical narratives. He failed in ways that haunted him until he died. He was human, which meant he was imperfect, which meant he made the best decisions he could with the knowledge he had. She showed photographs. Klaus at 24 beside Panzer 411. Klaus at 50, working in an American design studio. Klaus at 70, sketching civilian safety systems. And finally, Klaus at 82, sitting on his porch in Detroit, looking at something beyond the camera, his expression carrying weight that no lens could fully capture. This is my great-grandfather's legacy, not that he created sloped armor, but that he demonstrated how to carry the weight of innovation. With humility. With constant awareness of cost. With decades of effort to tip the balance toward protection rather than destruction. That's what I'm trying to honor, not the 6 weeks in France, but the 60 years afterward. Not the conquest, but the lifelong effort toward redemption. The audience was silent when she finished. Then they stood, not in celebration, but in recognition. These were people who understood that engineering wasn't morally neutral, that innovation carried responsibility, that the best any of us can do is acknowledge our choices and spend whatever time we have trying to make them count for something. After the ceremony, an elderly Israeli man approached Sarah. He was 95, walked with a cane, wore medals she didn't recognize. "I am Moshe Lev," he said in accented English. "I commanded a Merkava in the 1982 Lebanon War. Your great-grandfather's principles, the sloped armor design, saved my crew when we took an RPG hit. 3 of us walked away from that engagement. Without the armor geometry, none of us would have survived." He pulled out a photograph, 3 young men standing beside a damaged tank, grinning despite obvious exhaustion. We're all grandfathers now. Have 17 grandchildren between us. All because of mathematics and metal shaped correctly. He handed Sarah the photograph. Tell your great-grandfather's story. Tell people that innovation can save lives even across generations, across conflicts, across the complicated space between intention and consequence. We owe him that truth. Sarah accepted the photograph, added it to her collection of complicated inheritances. That night, alone in her hotel room, Sarah finally understood what Klaus had known, that you don't get to choose whether your work has consequences, only whether you acknowledge them and spend your life trying to make them mean something beyond their original context. She opened her laptop and began drafting a new project, a free, open-source protective design system that any humanitarian organization could use, modify, and implement without licensing fees or restrictions. No patents, no profit, no barriers between innovation and implementation. Just protection, offered freely to anyone trying to help people in the most dangerous places on Earth. She would call it the Richter Initiative. And somewhere, in whatever place mechanics and engineers go when their work outlives them, Klaus Richter smiled. Because his great-granddaughter finally understood, the story isn't about sloped armor or 6 weeks in France or even 60 years of redemption. The story is about choosing, every day, to let protection matter more than pride, to let service matter more than recognition, to let the work speak for itself while carrying the weight in silence. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. And sometimes, across generations and consequences and the impossible mathematics of measuring value against cost, it's enough. It's finally enough.